This was not easy to get. Hey guys, what's up? You're here with Doug, aka The Real Link, and I need some sleep. A couple weeks ago, NVIDIA launched their latest line of Ampere-based graphics cards, the RTX 3080 and 3090. Due to strict stock supply, absolutely overwhelming demand, and botters, the 3080 on launch day was nearly impossible to find, selling out in under 1 to 2 seconds. Basically, if you weren't human, you probably didn't get one. A week later, the 3090 was in very similar conditions, with quite high demand, very constricted supply being a harder to produce card, and those same scalpers and botters running rampant, and it only lasted for about a minute or two before it too could not be found. Well, this video is not sponsored by NVIDIA in any way. I do have to thank the Average Tech Reviews Discord, where myself and over 10,000 other people struggled and clamored virtually to try to click and get these cards for the moments that they existed. A couple weeks later, these cards are still very hard, if not impossible, to find for your average gamer. So that being said, their links were very special, and they linked me to a cart, and I got to grab one of the big dogs here, the RTX 3090, before it disappeared. So thank you guys very much for that. So like the video shows, this is going to be an unboxing and comparison benchmark video where I will compare the new 3090 against my outgoing Titan X Pascal era card, a couple generations old, with every benchmark I can possibly think of to throw at it. Now, I can't slot in a 3080 or an AMD Big Navi in the mix. One, because one's impossible to get, and the other is just not out yet. So I only have those two cards to work against. I'm not Steve or Jay or Linus, so it is what it is. That being said, also, should have buying two aftermarket partner cards. This was still out of my own pocket, kind of at this point spared no expense. So if you'd like to support the channel, affiliate links are in the description below to buy your affiliate card of choice, whether NVIDIA or AMD or other. Finally, this being said, this is not a gaming card, though I'm going to play a lot of games. With the R5 here, I do a lot of 4 and 8K work that pushes my GPU previously to the limit, as well as rendering and other production work quite often, all of which use the GPU significantly, as well as game a lot. So while I understand that this is a workstation card, this is not meant to be bought, not the most efficient thing for gaming, it's also I'd like to give the best of the best for the time being, so I didn't mind paying the expense. So with that being said, let's unbox the whole enchilada here, the big chungus. This is quite a brick. Take a look at it, plug it in after I rerun my piping in my system, and see what kind of numbers this thing's gonna put out. Alright guys, so after a very simple tape peeling and unboxing, it's pretty bare. We just have the card and this small little accessory sleeve that's below the foam insert. So initial impressions, this card is an absolute monster. It has to be at least a couple pounds, a kilogram. It is just absolutely massive. Dwarfed all the more fact that I am not a big person. This is just going to be an absolute beast in the machine. This is by far the biggest card I have ever held and will use. Inside this accessory kit we have NVIDIA Quick Start Guide, a GeForce Quick Start Guide, warning sheet, the unique new NVIDIA 12-pin connector, which uses two 8-pin connectors for power, and that is it. So, time to drain the system and swap everything out, and probably move some PCI Express cards around, because I don't think this is going to fit, even with all the allowance I have in my system as is. We're at 4 pounds 12 ounces. Or 2 kilograms and 158 grams. Figure while I'm at it, let's clean out the entire system, so I am unbolting everything. System is fully disassembled now, including cleaning out radiators, which I have not done in about 2 years. Clean, clean, not clean. First time also getting the CPU block apart, and we can see it needs a little bit of cleaning. And after a while of working, card is finally in. Synthetics. First up, we have 3DMark's suite of popular tests encompassing many stressful CPU and GPU situations. All tests were performed with 3DMark's Bench and Go default standard submission-worthy runs, so they vary from 1080p to 4K resolutions and varying complexity. Due to obsolescence, the mobile-friendly Iceborne, Iceborne Extreme, and CloudGate have been removed from results. The Titan X, of course, cannot run Port Royal, as that requires hardware ray tracing to function. Looking at the results for mobile and tablet-oriented workloads in Night Raid and Skydiver, we see that both cards are nearly neck and neck, representing more of a CPU threading limitation rather than raw GPU horsepower restrictions. Moving up to 1080p, tests like Firestrike, Time Spy, and Wildlife serve as lighter workloads, where the 3090 starts with a 150% to 200% lead. Stepping up to 1440p and 4K in Firestrike Ultra and Extreme, and Time Spy Extreme, the gap grows to 200%. The 3090, as promised, delivers up to 2 times results compared to the top-end Pascal-era cards. Awesome. PCIe bandwidth test had the Titan showing 12.3 GB per second and the 3090 at 12.9 GB per second respectively. If I ever migrate to a PCI 4 based board, it'd be neat to rerun this test in the future. The Port Royal test, inclusive of only using the RTX 3090's ray tracing and DLSS, was tested as well. With DLSS on, I obtained 134 frames per second, and with it off, the ray tracing brought the card down to 61 frames per second, an amazing example of RT and DLSS 2.0 combined showing what it can do.
As expected, despite the hefty overclock, the Titans simply cannot keep up in one-node tests. Next up we have the DirectX 12 API feature overhead test. While not meant to directly compare two graphics cards, it's still interesting to run this test on both cards to see how they perform under the DirectX 12 API. Next, we test with Unigine's popular suite of tests, including Superposition. I was intrigued to see how varied the results would be, since each benchmark mode states that the texture and engine are optimized, perhaps greater so than compared to some game engines. While the Titan X puts up a better than anticipated fight at 8K resolution, it simply is outmatched by the RTX 3090. The 3090, again, at stock mind you, is easily able to pull roughly double the performance in all modes, falling slightly behind double at 4K and 8K. Next, I have to include Unigine Heaven and Valley, as they are the classics by this point and older than dirt, but establish good engine testing baselines. But we don't see quite 2x gain in either scenario. The RTX 3090 handily increases its lead in Heaven and probably runs into CPU limitations in Valley, but it's still a win though. For GeekBench 4 and GeekBench 5, two popular Mac and PC testing benchmarks, we see naturally a huge gain with the RTX 3090, scoring over double in Geek 4 and triple in Geek 5, which is huge. Only this OpenCL test was run due to trial licensing and test consistency between versions, rather than Metal or NVIDIA CUDA. Next up we have PassMark, a popular and more user-friendly benchmark for comparing hardware and systems. While the testing compute is thorough on the CPU end, the GPU end is focused more on sheer frame rates than scene or geometric complexity. While my system with either card ranks in the mid-99th percentile worldwide, the RTX 3090 barely budges the score, though it's still a victory. Productivity. Let's start with guns blazing and testing out the popular architectural rendering engine Lumion, as amongst all the productivity tests I ran, this was my most shocking. Lumion is based on a commonly licensed C++ Polygon Cruncher code used in many 3D modeling software packages and is strictly a solo GPU-based render for its exports and workflow production. Needless to say, if you're in the BIM industry and rely on CUDA or GPU processing for your work, or you're an architect that renders in Lumion, you're going to want this GPU. Taking for example the Farnsworth House sample render project, we see a nearly 4-time reduction in render time, saving 11 hours. Other various 4-hour renders are now completed in 1 hour, a lengthy lunch break perhaps. Renders such as Villa Amanzi, previously taking all night on the Titan, can now be completed in a portion of a workday, saving valuable time. If you handle a lot of CG work and render in your day-to-day projects, especially at 4K resolution, an RTX 3090 or 3080 will save you time and money and regain productivity hands down. Yes, you'll still have to wait for the machine to render, but it's not as long now. Next we'll cover some results as nearly as impressive as Lumion, but this time with Blender version 2.90 and a whole host of benchmarks released for it, as well as some previous models. Keep in mind some tests have asterisks, since the buckets are not subdivided into sufficient enough chunks for a high core count CPU to handle, so whether the bucket is assigned to an HT core or not makes the exact rendering time hard to pin down for some models. For Blender, the tests are split into triplicates: CPU compute representing the cycles renderer with the GPU turned off, GPU compute with the CPU turned off, and CPU plus GPU compute with both CPU and GPU compute on and combined. While some tests are not the beasts they once were, they're included here for posterity, such as BMW, Horo, and FishyCat. All rendering, unless specified in notes, is done in cycles, though some projects tested are EV only. Pavilion sees a 3x speedup straight via GPU compute with Blender Cycles renderer. Classroom also falls by 3 times, taking only 1/3 as long on the 3090. For Splash 279 with the Barbershop, it's a challenging render target to pin down because the scene falls between very simple and very complex buckets. So if a hyper-threaded CPU core lands on a harder to compute thread, the time increases, whereas a GPU thread can calculate it promptly. Meanwhile, no simple buckets in Barbershop affect the time based on the core, whereas the GPU testing is more consistent with the difficulty of the bucket presented by nature of GPU compute operating at 1 compute standard compared to real versus HT CPU cores, and the complexity of which bucket they land on. Blunderman suffers from the same low bucket count, and I reran it multiple times to ensure the RTX 3090 gains were not a mistake, but they're true. This robot may grind to a halt on the CPU, but Ampere cuts through it like a laser, completing it in literally 1/10 the time. Gooseberry is still sped up by 2 times, which is impressive. Focus Studio and Coro show similar results to Classroom, and FishyCat significantly cut GPU times. Spring and Butterfly are some of the most computationally involved benchmark tests I could run, and it's neat to see them render at double and triple the speed compared to before. The only reason some renders catch up on the Titan X is that they're leveraging, or rather relying on the 28 threads of CPU performance more greatly than the 3090. In fact, Blender results pose a quandary. Normally your multi-core CPU does the bulk of the lifting in Blender, and the GPU can supplement it where it can. With an RTX 3090 being so powerful, however, it really breaks Blender processing into 2 tiers. If you have 14 cores and 28 threads and below, I'd simply suggest turning off CPU rendering fully, as it's not having the GPU trip on itself and assigning buckets, and it's completing at nearly the same time as many of the CPU plus GPU selections combined. If you have greater than 16 cores, especially overclocked, such as a Threadripper, keep GPU and CPU combined turned on, as the net time gains will still be worth it, scene and processor depending. In some scenes, it was actually slower to turn on the CPU. Pretty mind-boggling. For the Eevee-based tests, they took such a short time that many frames would need to be rendered to see a time savings. However, Junk Shop still came in at nearly double the performance compared to the Titan X Pascal. The next heavyweight we have up are the gargantuan 90 gig benchmarks of SPECViewPerf 2013 and 2020, each taking nearly 30 minutes to run 1 iteration. These fall into production even though it may appear as a synthetic test because it loads a wide variety of professional programs without needing their standalone licenses in order to execute generally simple test runs. Standard Performance Evaluation Corporation's test suite includes many heavyweights in the CAD, CAM, engineering, and medical industries, such as 3ds Max, CATIA, Creo, Energy, Seismology, Maya, Medical, Siemens NX Powertrain, and SolidWorks. For the easier-to-run SPECViewPerf 2013, we see the RTX 3090 overtake the Titan X Pascal by anywhere from 133 to 200%. The test was run multiple times to ensure CATIA, Siemens, and SolidWorks results were correct. This is most likely due to additional floating point capacity and slightly more specialized instructions inherently built into the Titan class series of card compared to even a flagship semi-professional card such as the 3090. For most modeling needs, however, the RTX 3090 gains significantly in modeling and rendering capability, so if you use one of the programs shown in this chart where it's ahead, chances are likely it'll still help your workflow. For the updated SPECViewPerf 2020 benchmark, results are slightly more varied, with the Titan taking 3 of 8 victories, again in CATIA, Siemens, and closely in Creo. However, the 3090 retaking victory in SolidWorks with other program results unchanged, with about 120 to 200% higher. Again, this is a mixture of card core and memory structure and program integration, so results will vary depending on your machine and model configuration. Next up, we have the always capable Autodesk 3ds Max, an incredibly popular architectural and animation program. While my college models no longer suffice as overly challenging to compute, taking generally hours or less to render, I reached out to the kind Andrei Pastashuk of AP Designs for a suitable baseline establishment and have to thank him for this minor collaboration. His information is at the end of the video if you want to look him up. He was able to provide me a first-class bedroom interior akin to what you'd see in a Dubai mansion or mega yacht, yet with incredibly compact geometric structure. While my Titan test ran into some challenges with V-Ray, ray tracing integration, and licensing, the 3090 test was able to be successful. As such, while the CPU render time is pretty consistent at about 35 minutes each, the 3090 could compute the scene in barely 5 minutes with NVIDIA V-Ray plugin. Again, a worthwhile speedup if you need to visually check your work or render a lot of data or have a huge animation. Gauging by the previous loaded personal test scenarios with 3ds Max rasterization, however, a Titan X Pascal time is probably closer to the 12 to 16 minute range, which would be estimated. So again, a huge speedup and win for the 3090. In close proximity to Max, we have Autodesk Inventor's benchmark, which can be ran once the product is installed. If Inventor uses the GPU, it must need a more complex scene, or it does not rely on the GPU too heavily, since the Titan X Pascal and 3090 scores are both very close, in the 1-14.xx range, as being neck and neck. The next benchmark we have here is V-Ray. The standalone benchmark tests compute similar to the integrated add-in rendering plugin for many 3D renderers without relying on having that particular software installed. We can see that while scores are low, the RTX 3090s is still nearly 3 times faster than the Titan X Pascal, making it a fantastic card for rendering calculations. In similar vein, Otoy's Octane Bench standalone GPU renderer test shows massive improvements with the horsepower of the RTX 3090, again achieving nearly 350% or 3.5 times improvement. Some scenes in the breakout dialog were as low as 1.5 times, and others were almost 7 times, so your model time may vary by complexity. But overall, there's no chance for the Titan here, and the 3090 reigns supreme. Moving toward gaming engines next, we tried out CryEngine's Neon Noir software-based ray tracing gritty city scene again on the RTX 3090. As we can see, the 3090 started at 150% improvement at lower resolution and climbed to roughly 250% or a 2.5 time improvement at 4K across the board. It even put out decent scoring at 8K, though FPS was hovering around 20 at that resolution. But in general, as a more stressful RT-based benchmark, it's great to see Ampere in general handle this test much better than the Pascal. In the same vein of ray tracing benchmarks, up next is RTGI's Petra benchmark, a far more obscure but nonetheless impressive showcase of real-time global illumination coupled with ray tracing designed by Simon Majar of Wilson Studio. This benchmark has so much lighting calculation needed that it's essentially a slideshow on a non-RTX-based GPU. Jumping to the 3090, they showed among the biggest FPS gains with the power of Ray Tracing 2.0 and other optimizations with a roughly 3 to 4 times gain, and so even this developmental build of Unreal Engine 4.5 runs at a decently playable FPS. Moving on to Folding at Home, the popular disease-solving distributed computing project launched by the University of Stanford since 2003, we see yet another tremendous gain for the RTX 3090. If you'd like to assist with disease crunching and protein folding, Ampere architecture helps make scientific progress faster, with a roughly 250% or 2.5 times speedup compared to Pascal. Even the most complicated work units that I came across completed in just about an hour's time. Astounding. Looking now at crypto mining, we tried both NiceHash and EthMiner using Phoenix Miner version 5.1c against popular Bitcoin and Ethereum algorithms, and again we see a significant improvement by moving to the RTX 3090. The ETH computation scales by roughly 3 times in my testing, yielding over 100 megahashes per second with similar computational increase for Bitcoin. While GPU mining has become selectively profitable and a hotly debated topic as of late with crypto prices surging, it is at least nice to see these performance gains line up with other Ampere testing thus far. Next we bring up Puget Systems' Puget Bench for Adobe After Effects, a popular side program to Premiere Pro for rendering many additional video effects. While traditionally a very CPU and RAM hungry program, I wanted to run these benches to see if utilizing a new GPU would offer any improvement in general, as most tests do not utilize them much. Sadly, we see barely a 10% gain, and even worse, a neutral gain in Premiere Pro. If you rely on lots of GPU-based effects, sure, maybe there is a benefit to investing in these cards, but otherwise if you do a lot of video work, these cards really won't help you. Time to move on. Speaking of video, however, there is one benefit where the horsepower does come into play: playback of high memory and codec-based 4K and 8K footage. While Premiere relies more on the storage I/O and CPU threading, and a new GPU did nothing in the program itself to improve the situation, even testing suites from 2018 to 2020, Windows 10's own video player was far more receptive to smoother playback of 8K footage, with the 3090 not constrained by horsepower or memory in this task. Whereas 4K H.264 and H.265 was okay on the Titan, 8K is unplayable, regardless of storage used. Meanwhile, on the 3090, 8K playback far closer to actual filmed frame rate from the Canon R5 and raw C-Log based footage via Windows and Canon DPP played back far easier as well. Gaming. Next we move on to a lot of gaming tests, which I'm sure some of you are here for. Diablo 3. We start with Diablo 3 not because I don't have A to C titles, but it was just tested first. While mostly CPU-bound title, we still see similar FPS overall with a slightly higher minimum on the 3090. 4K on both the Titan and 3090 is easily achievable. The RTX 3090 even has no issue pushing a smooth experience in this title at 8K, tested with NVIDIA's DSR 4X setting.
The ancients smile on me.
Path of Exile. In the ARPG space, next we move to the far more demanding Path of Exile, a title that, while CPU-driven, does focus on some GPU muscle for its effects. While this game is entirely playable on the Titan, the 3090 simply obliterates the requirements of PoE, obtaining easily between a 3 to 5 times improvement in FPS at 4K max, even during heavy combat in delves or memories. Meanwhile, moving up to 8K, Path maintains 60 to 90 frames per second as another totally playable title at 8K DSR on the 3090. Final Fantasy XIV version 1.0. For the original classic version of FF14 built on the Crystal Tools engine, and which was summarily known for its overuse of flower pots and beautiful landscapes circa 2010, I thought it neat to test if finally, maybe finally, cards could handle what the original game promised. While the Titan is powerful enough, the 3090 takes FF14 to another level. While significant gains occur with the benchmarks at 1080p, 4K leaps ahead with settings ahead of very high across the board. Clearly, either card is powerful, but the 3090 will have zero issue for the rest of this MMO's life. Final Fantasy XIV versions 2.0 to 5.0. In similar vein, testing the standalone modern benchmarks for FF14 produced fantastic results, since the game is nearly entirely GPU driven. Results at 4K are close to double across the board. While 1.0 and A Realm Reborn couldn't initialize 8K at all, and Heavensward almost got there but crashed, Stormblood and Shadowbringers did handle high resolution and scored medium once benchmarking was complete with max settings. For FPS in-game during a mixture of combat that was repeatable, Bostra 48-Man Fates for example, at 4K we see over a doubling of performance and close to 30 frames per second at 8K, which is decently playable. Needless to say, if you enjoy your time in Eorzea, a consideration of Ampere cards should be made. Final Fantasy XV. Exploring the wilds of Eos also brings us several benchmarks and tests here. The Journey of the Bros is one of the most expansive semi-open worlds to date and looks amazing, and while it performed okay on the Titan, it wasn't terribly smooth. I felt that if maybe I could get 40 to 50 frames a second on the 3090, I'd be happy. Instead, with testing, I'm greeted with benchmark results not quite doubled, which comfortably ranks high to very high, as the benchmark test itself is quite unoptimized. The game itself, however, speaks a different story and was one of the more impressive gains from the 3090 architecture, easily gaining triple the performance of Titan. Really, mind blown. It's quite something to see FF15 run smoothly, and that's before turning on NVIDIA DLSS, as it's one of the few titles to have it patched in. I couldn't see any irregularities with DLSS on, and it boosted frame rates well past 70 and occasionally past 100. Wow.
Hey, Ignis! Instructions!
While the benchmark couldn't handle 8K, the game itself can. And while very beautiful, it's one of the titles I wouldn't call quite ready to game at 8K yet, as by default there's some input lag and it overall feels very sluggish. Turning on DLSS removes the delays and gets FPS back to the 30s, and so only with DLSS on is the game semi-playable at such a high resolution.
Pronto, look alive.
Guild Wars 2. For GW2, this unique game from ArenaNet generated some unexpected results. While the engine has updated over time, the game still uses a limited amount of CPU cores, relies on frequency over GPU muscle, and was amongst the worst gainer moving to the 3090. While outdoor world exploration and combat and the game in general did see higher minimum FPS, which is good, the major hubs of Divinity's Reach and Lion's Arch saw zero improvement. Furthermore, at 8K, while the game is scaled fine and max frame rates won't be as high naturally, the minimums and averages really stayed close to the 4K results, so this game would count as playable, provided you have enough CPU power to back it. But if you're looking for better GW2 performance, upgrading to Ampere isn't going to do it for this title. Battlefield 3. Following Bravo Company, we tested the Thunder Run tank battle scene of the main campaign, which has some of the most volumetric effects and heavy processing of any level in this older but still graphically beautiful title. The intro to this level is repeatable, so it's easy to test. While the TXP could play this game fine, it started to choke on the smoke and effects. The 3090 meanwhile shrugs this off and gains a net 7 times minimum improvement, and even hits the engine cap of 200 frames per second at 4K repeatedly. While the menus are microscopic at 8K, the game generally ran in the 40s to 50s and was pretty playable, UI aside. another win for Ampere. If you played Battlefield 4 or Battlefield 5, I'd imagine DICE's optimizations and engine scaling continue to be awe-inspiring, and upgrading to Ampere would probably offer a significant improvement in those games as well.
Vectors maintain advance. Scan and identify.
These guys are well trained. Not breaking range.
Crysis 3. Next up, we have one of the sequels to one of the most infamous PC titles and series of all time, the literal Can It Run Crysis? Brother. Crysis 3's first two levels of the Liberty Dome in ruined New York are shrouded in tons of rain, wind, volumetric lighting, fog, dense grass, high-res textures, sun shafts, and more, creating a very next-gen feel for a game already nearly 8 years old, having been released in 2013. On my Titan X Pascal at 4K very high, the game is at least playable, but not sufficiently fast enough to be enjoyable, hovering around 15 frames per second or so most of the time. Testing with the 3090, despite the huge horsepower behind it, this title was one of the very few to struggle to hit 4K 60, but was still able to provide a fluid and fantastic playable experience for the early levels and the remainder of the campaign, now that the game would push to the 40 to 60 frame per second range, again scaling by a roughly 3 times improvement. At 8K, we're back in Titan territory with the game sitting sub 15 frames per second. While the 3090 can run some games at 8K, this is absolutely not one of them. But boy does it look sharp. Maybe we'll need a Ceph-powered GPU to get this title running at 8K 60.
Make the diversion. Profit, let's go. Romeo Actual, this is Romeo 1. Initiating burnout, over.
Copy that, Romeo 1.
Sometimes I feel sorry for these bastards. Here she is, the Liberty Dome. One big sweaty armpit. Not that you'd notice inside that suit, but it's hotter than a Vindaloo in here.
Nier Automata. Another popular story-driven game series is Nier, and I finally got to play a bit of Automata a couple years after it came out. For my limited time so far, the game's dizzying camera angles, bullet hell, open exploration, and overall quality are amazing, but again, it's a more modern game, needing newer hardware. Holding only in the 20s or so on the Titan, the game was playable, but not too smooth of an experience at 4K max. Meanwhile, the way the engine is built and relies on frame timing, 60 frames per second is the engine cap, and the 3090 achieves that easily without breaking a sweat. Stepping up to 8K after a few crashes, and the game ran comfortably around 30 frames per second in the early city area. Another game I'd put into the playable category, though you can definitely feel the timing be a little off. Next gen should cement this title at 8K 60 though. Metro 2033 Benchmark. Stepping into the dark world of post-apocalyptic Moscow in the first and therefore most unoptimized rendition of the Metro series of games to date, we are greeted with, again, two facets where sometimes Benchmark's first games are radically different. The included subway benchmark has huge amounts of volumetric smoke that seem to rely on CPU calculations and other effects not fully optimized for GPUs, so the FPS dips regardless of the GPU used. The minimums are still about 20, just that the 3090 achieves higher FPS ranges. Meanwhile, the benchmark at 8K is a chugging mess, achieving no higher than roughly 30 frames a second max, and regularly falls into the single digits. Gross. Metro 2033 the game. Thankfully, 4A Games and THQ did better with the game's launch itself, and while it was pretty playable on the Titan, the 3090 sees a 5-fold minimum improvement, holding far above 60 frames per second all the time. Moving to 8K, we're again back to how the Titan felt with the game around 20 frames per second. Not entirely unplayable, just not smooth. Another borderline title at this resolution for sure. but at least at 4K, you can now delve into the depths of Moscow and the wastelands at 4K comfortably. Genshin Impact. This stunningly gorgeous late 2020 free-to-play game took streaming by storm, and while I've not had too much time to sink into it, I'm left very impressed. Since this mobile-based title relies on the Unity engine, while not as optimized as other toolkits out there, Publisher MyHoYo seems to have done a good job. Because of capping this engine at a hard 60 frames per second limit, I've chosen to rely on a couple tools to check GPU usage rather than FPS, where in this case lower is better, and slightly indicative of relative performance gained. While the Titan has zero issue pushing this game at 4K 60 frames per second maxed, the usage is about 65%, and we see the 3090 is about half of that. Stepping up the game via DSR to 8K shoots the 3090's usage to 100%, but it still appears to hold 60 frames per second solid in all of the early story areas I ran through. What a gorgeous title, easily playable at 8K. Paladins. By request, I chose to benchmark this lesser-known 5 vs 5 battle royale akin to Overwatch. I was told that the requirements to run this game were pretty low, so I thought I'd see how it would perform since it's optimized on Unreal Engine 3. A few intense battle arenas later, and the numbers are good if you're running higher hardware. Even the Titan achieves far past 200 frames per second here, with the 3090 only increasing those numbers to nearly 300 frames per second all the time. But the limited gains show that we're waiting on the CPU to push data faster, so my Skylake 7940X 14-core overclocked chip at 4.5 GHz is indeed the bottleneck. But we're running it fluid enough either way to not matter. At 8K, we're still holding nearly 60 frames per second at all times with very infrequent dips below. Another game that's playable today at 8K. Pew pew. Phantasy Star Online 2. This classic and popular Japanese title recently hit its second wave of major interest in the US with the North American client launch a bit ago, and so I got a bit more hooked into it the second time I tested it out. The core game engine's old enough that I didn't really expect anything surprising here though, and I was correct. In fact, the benchmark scores are nearly identical, so we're totally CPU bound. If I want to pass above 120,000 points, it won't be with this CPU. But graphically, we're near 400 frames per second, so should you wish to play this title on a modern card, there's nothing to worry about. You can enjoy your ARC's operations comfortably on modern hardware. Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter World Iceborne. With the rise of Iceborne's expansion onto the PC more recently, more hunters than ever are taking their weapons to the battlefield to assist the 5th Fleet. With a heavy reliance on geometry and effects though, Monster Hunter World's requirements, especially on the higher settings, are no slouch. While I did manage to play through all the base game in Iceborne on the Titan at 4K max, reaching generally in the low 20 frames per second most of the time, the game was certainly sluggish, but playable. Swapping to the 3090 was akin to leapfrogging weapons, and one of the most surprising titles improved by Ampere in all of my testing. While I thought that maybe gaining double frames per second in the 40s to 50s would suffice, instead I was greeted closer to 70 frames per second minimum, and only climbing from there once out of the hubs. But it gets even better. Monster Hunter World is one of the few titles currently supporting DLSS, and with DLSS 2.0, supposedly Nvidia's implementation is better than before, so I gave it a shot. While moving the slider to +1 definitely over-sharpens things, leaving it at 0 or at a bias toward -1 left the game feeling visually the same to me, yet with enhanced frames per second. Even moving from 90 with DLSS off, now 90 is almost the baseline, and FPS gains up to 140 are achieved, which is just insane. I did not expect a near 7 times speed up for this game. .8K with and without DLSS performed decently too, hovering around 30 to 35 frames per second, though it had some odd black anomalies happen, and whether it was the engine, game code, card, or something else causing it, I could not tell, but still, just shocking overall. Tomb Raider 2013. While I never played much of the originals on PlayStation, seeing Shadow of the Tomb Raider included in so many benchmarks had me reevaluate looking into the rebooted series. For the first installment of the game in 2013, things may look a little dated, but it's still needing some power to push frames. While the Titan achieves easily playable frames per second, the 3090 more than doubles it, so this title should present no challenge to run now. Meanwhile, at 8K, the 3090 achieves closer to 30 frames per second, so this would appear to be decently playable. Civilization VI. While turn time and pacing are more important in this strategy title than sheer FPS, the Civ games have gradually incorporated more luscious graphics and unit detail, requiring more GPU grunt. Moving to the 3090, it appears we're not as CPU bound as I thought, with the card capable of a near 2 times improvement at 4K max over the Titan X Pascal. Even at 8K, we're getting frame times low enough to indicate 60 plus frames per second, so while your units might be microscopic, UI scaling aside, the game itself is very playable. Shogun 2 Total War. In this older feudal Japan strategy game, it was originally a contender for benchmarking due to its CPU-heavy workload and moderately decent graphics for the time. While today's hardware can handle the title just fine, swapping to an even better GPU is useless and offers no improvement. Furthermore, at higher resolutions, the game UI does not scale at all, leaving for a frustrating play experience. Grand Theft Auto V. Dashing and smashing around the city of Los Santos, this go-everywhere shoot-'em-up has been on PC for what seems like forever, but doesn't have the most optimized engine. Despite this, minimum frames per second and overall smoothness is indeed increased significantly from the Titan X Pascal days. The game is playable at 4K max easily on both cards, though while holding in the 30s to 50s on the Titan X and about 50 to 100 frames on the 3090. At 8K, however, the mix of high CPU and GPU demand along with inefficiencies leads to sluggish performance on the 3090, reaching in the low 20 frames per second. Again, another title considered borderline playable at 8K since GTA isn't too fast-paced. Doom Eternal. Doom and id Tech has always been known as a pioneer of computer graphics, and their 2020 version of Doom Eternal is no different. It's a super highly optimized game running on Vulkan, and stunningly gorgeous and gory. While having a high-end GPU is nice for this game, it's certainly not required to rip and tear the demons of hell asunder, at least for below 4K. For 4K Ultra Nightmare settings, the Titan holds near 60 frames per second or higher, and the 3090 gains by at least double or more, which is pretty nice to see in an optimized title. But man, throwing this into 8K is pretty shocking. It's playable, today, at near 60 frames per second all day long. Only very minor areas saw FPS dip to the 50s or 40s. Shocking. Minecraft Java. Next up we have that most classical, bloody Minecraft Java. Next up we have that most classical of blocky, create anything games, Minecraft. While I never played it much, I could appreciate it for its sandbox atmosphere and expansive world. But with RTX being highlighted for the newer GPUs, I thought it neat to test both Java, Windows Bedrock, and Windows Beta with RTX to see what kinds of numbers and performance overall that we'd see in apples-to-apples comparisons. Since Java's for programming and not designed entirely for graphics, we see pretty much identical results in the most classic of Minecraft clients, though a bug or some other issue caused the 3090 to start at high FPS then just keep dropping to the 30s near the ground. No idea why. I also tested in creative mode up high and on a beach shore with a concrete and glass helm I quickly made that I had hoped, come RTX, would make for some really neat light casts, and boy it does. Minecraft Windows. Switching over to Windows where we gain full GPU support in DirectX, it'd be expected that we'd gain far better performance at the expense of some of the classic mods in the original game. At the absolute highest 4K max settings, Minecraft is still taxing on both CPU and GPU, and we again see the 3090 offer gains from 2x all the way up to 7 times in some cases, which is just insane. Minecraft RTX Beta. While Minecraft in Windows does not have DLSS, it does have RTX, and because of the focus of NVIDIA and the developers, this game out of any with RTX I could test, which granted it wasn't too many mind you, by far underwent the biggest transformation of any of the titles. It's just such a night and day difference playing Minecraft with RTX on, and that's even before doing anything with mods to overhaul the game at all. You do take a performance hit to the upper 30s to 60 FPS range, but the fidelity is something else. The original home I built with eventually anticipating to test RTX in the beta, sure enough, with RTX on, looks gorgeous and colorful and nuts. Just wow. This should only keep getting better for the generations after Ampere. I couldn't get the game to run at 8K though, as it seems to not offer a display resolution toggle for Minecraft Windows. Ark Survival Evolved. Next up we have the expansive world of Ark Survival Evolved. While this game features huge maps and areas to explore, it also has crushing requirements in the highest settings, especially at 4K. While my Titan could manage the game okay except for the largest maps like Ragnarok, it's nice to see the extra horsepower of the 3090 simply plow through the world of crafting, dinosaurs, and survival, achieving a straight 2x performance gain to near 60 most of the time. The game didn't like 8K though, it didn't really want to run it at all, so you'll have to stick with 4K settings on max. Planet Coaster. This whimsical, creative fantasy playground, well built in the ilk of Roller Coaster Tycoon and other create and build games, has surprisingly high system requirements. While manageable on lower settings and smaller parks just fine, large parks crush the CPU for AI calculations and the GPU for overall scene effects and complexity once parks grow, especially at 4K. Discovering the community-built park of Neo Tokyo by Combat Wombat on the Community Hub gave me a hyper-detailed park of huge size to test against, and the results were pretty shocking. I didn't expect the literally 3-minute load time, nor the soul-crushing frame rate once loading this map, but I asked for a test, and I got one. The neon map of Neo Tokyo, while looking cool, simply crawled on the Titan, rarely hitting even 20 frames a second without guests in the park at all, whereas a regular scenario park I was working on ran closer to about 35 frames per second. The 3090 helps by doubling to tripling these numbers, and while 20 frames per second in Neo Tokyo doesn't sound impressive, it is when you have an average of 6 to start. And a more down-to-earth park hitting 4K 60 solid all the time is easily done. So while one may think Planet Coaster is a nice, easy-to-run game for kids, again, at the highest settings, don't let the cheery nature fool you into thinking low requirements at 4K. The game didn't want to load 8K at all and just crashed. Horizon Zero Dawn, another game focusing on a beautiful world with a mix of nature and technology. I had never played the game or previous titles, so I was wondering how something newer would perform on the hardware overall. The game uses a custom in-house engine for its visuals. Well, again, the Titan performed well. It made the game playable at 1080p and decently at 4K. The 3090 flat out doubled everything shown. Even 8K reached near 30 frames a second, which would be playable in a game environment like this. It's a very beautiful game. Shadow of the Tomb Raider. While being turned off from the original series as feeling it was too cliché, the 2013 and later games rebooting the series were included in so many big YouTube benchmarking reviews that my interest was piqued. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is the latest of the 3 games to have come out, and since it's a 2018 title, it's nearly state-of-the-art for visuals. A big note is that this game had several permutations to bench and settings unique to Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Shadows can either be cast by traditional methods in Engine or by using ray tracing code closer to global illumination. Furthermore, NVIDIA DLSS can be toggled on or off separately, thus giving us 24 theoretical baseline options from 1080p, 4K, and 8K, only some of which I graphed for ease of testing. Ray tracing off uses software ultra shadows. Ray tracing on uses ray trace-based shadows just for ease of graph nomenclature. DLSS has no variants, simply off or on. If software shadows are on, RT is off, and vice versa, so it's nice to see the game offering 2 options depending on your hardware. While the Titan can manage their game okay at 4K Ultra with nothing fancy on, the FPS naturally tanks hard once more ray tracing is added into the mix, showcasing the card's age. 1080p results were not graphed, but I'd gauged from scaling that both the software and ray trace-based solutions set at Ultra would be playable at that resolution. Meanwhile, while 8K was harder to get going on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, as usual I left the Titan out of it completely due to a literal slideshow of performance. The Titan does not have RTX since it's a Pascal era card, so it likewise cannot effectively test the RT-on scenarios. The 3090 was far easier to change any setting and go, and with newer architecture plus more resources has no issues smoothly running Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Performance gains range from slightly doubled when everything is off to quintupled once both ray tracing is off but DLSS is on. Again, I saw no anomalies or oddities experienced while testing DLSS on my end, and the game is still super sharp. Even ray tracing on with DLSS on puts FPS never lower than 60, so I can see why NVIDIA highlighted this title at launch. The game looks and plays amazingly on the 3090. At 8K, however, it's more of a mixed bag, where I'd call the game borderline playable. while everything off runs sluggish, turning ray tracing on alone simply crashed the driver. But having DLSS doing all the heavy lifting once turned on was very impressive, especially going from the ray tracing on FPS of literally 2 to the ray tracing plus DLSS on of the 20s to 30s. With ray tracing off but DLSS on, the title is comfortably playable at 8K. This is still enough to call the game a win, in my opinion. Power draw. Finally, for power draw, I figured the numbers would be pretty easy to calculate since the only changing factor is the GPU, and I was correct. Compared to the roughly 200 to 225 watts or so of the Titan X Pascal, the 3090 is a BF GPU and does draw significantly more power that you can feel as heat exhaust for sure, hands down. With a highly overclocked CPU, lots of fans, and other case peripherals along with the monitor, it's not surprising to see the system pull near 1 kilowatt. If you are running two 3090s in SLI with maxed power sliders, consider a 1600 watt power supply as the minimum, as a single 3090 sits at 350 to 375 watts by default, right in line with specs, but it can edge a bit closer to 400 to 410 watts if you adjust the power allowed to max. I did not thoroughly test overclocking short of Port Royal, and it seemed like my Founders Edition card could manage plus 160 MHz core and about plus 210 MHz memory, and that was it, at plus 18% power. Other programs that were untested as this card is plenty powerful for my needs even at stock. But using utilities like GPU-Z show power as the constant limiter. The cooler is so massive it can heat soak and take a huge amount of draw, however I personally won't be modding my card. Temperatures were amazing, and while not quite on par with water cooling, it's by far the quietest and coldest air-cooled card I've owned. No GPU load ever had the card much over 60 Celsius max, with most gaming happening in the low 50s or even into the 40s Celsius at a manual 65% fan curve. I can't really hear the card over the system, and it stays cool.
Alright guys, that's a wrap. Hope you found these graphs insightful and helpful. That's a lot of data I just covered. Obviously I would have loved to included other CPUs and GPUs into the mix, but then this video would never get done, and that wouldn't help anyone. So now in terms of price to performance value, obviously this top end costing what it does, it's not here. It never has been. But if you're wanting one of the most powerful cards out barring Quadro, the 3090 should certainly satisfy your graphical needs. Like Jensen said at NVIDIA, if you're on the 10000 series Pascal architecture, I found a gargantuan improvement moving to Ampere and can wholeheartedly recommend it as a product. In terms of productivity, if you're a 3D animator, architecture student, renderer, model in Blender, and do other CAD work, I can wholly recommend the 3090 in the Ampere series. Some work as an Octane Bench and Lumion and other renderers saw a 3 to 7x speedup, taking a tremendous amount of time savings into effect if your work revolves around rendering and production. It's just a gargantuan improvement from the Pascal era, and while I can't compare on the AMD side, obviously some of these programs are more optimized for NVIDIA, but there's a tremendous speed up. So if you're looking for a new render card for a workstation, don't want to shell out the money for Quadro, barring some of the driver optimizations, and looking to get rendering done, this card is the card for you. In terms of gaming, I was very surprised to see that the vast majority of all titles could be pushed at 4K 60, if not 4K 120, barring just a couple titles which are very CPU or engine limited and go beyond just having this card being the bottleneck. In terms of implementing some titles with NVIDIA DSR to 8K, as well as DTS and ray tracing, it really was amazing and insightful to see some titles like Minecraft take advantage of the NVIDIA RTX to truly change the game world into accurate shaded, shadowed, reflective surfaces, and for some titles it really literally does feel like playing a brand new game. For NVIDIA marketing this card as an 8K capable card, of course I used DSR to test that, and I'm surprised that in most titles, compared to what some other larger review sites say, 8K is quite playable on the vast majority of titles I tried. Some titles like Doom were able to get 8K 60. Many other titles could do at least 8K 30. Only a handful of titles such as Crysis 3 or Shadow of the Tomb Raider were truly below 8K 10 or something that would be sluggish and unplayable. But even in that case, NVIDIA DLSS 2.0 raised the frame rates enough to where titles were mostly playable, and it's commendable to NVIDIA that despite fluff and 8K being a 1%er benchmark, it's the way things are going to eventually go, and it's good to see them starting to take the gains of that into effect and present some playable titles today on Ampere as a first generation. Performance aside, if you're willing to take a 10 to 20% hit on your frame rate, you can always downgrade to a 3080 for half the price and overclock that and get very close to a 3090's price to performance for a lot less money, or simply overclock one of the aftermarket add-in-board partner models. Touching again on using DSR, DLSS, and RTX, it really is cool to see these integrated features affect the game and integration so strongly and not feel just simply like tacked add-on features that do minor things to enhance your gameplay. Of course, it takes the right title, but these really do feel like very well meshed, game-changing things that help improve perception and overall immersion in the titles, as well as the DLSS technology to improve frame rates and just overall move the technology ahead rather than just be lame implementations that aren't getting anywhere. This is great to see NVIDIA do a first or second generation pass of these technologies, flesh them out, and hopefully take this tech into AI and other avenues moving forward, just beyond being a graphics company. As a note, online, which is a meme where is 10 gig enough on the 3080, in turn, I'll also question, is 24 gig of VRAM enough on the 3090, especially when testing at 8K? And for now, I'd say yes. Some of the games where the performance is starting to limit do reach the peak of the VRAM, but the performance is not up to 8K 30 or 8K 60 in most cases, where it's a completely acceptable level of frame rate and performance gain without turning down some settings. For example, in FF15, we're seeing 22 gigs of VRAM used, Monster Hunter World was over 16 gig, GTA 5 was 12 gig, tremendous amounts of video texture memory used, but again, with these three games, you're getting more roughly 30-ish, 20 to 30 frames a second, so not quite up to a completely smooth playable frame rate, but at least for now it looks like the VRAM will hold out, and obviously any card that's going to start pushing 8K, you're going to want comfortably above 16 to 20 gigs of VRAM for the future. It'll be great to see NVIDIA pushing this out into the next generation after Ampere to see if they continue the moniker of 8K playable and where the market goes as 8K TVs and monitors slowly work their way into the marketplace for professionals. So if you are the 1%er, if you are watching this and happen to be one of the few who own an 8K monitor or TV, congrats. This card, obviously title depending, can actually let you game in 8K quite well depending on the title. Obviously some things, say again Shadow of the Tomb Raider, DLSS is literally doing all the work as the benchmarking game was literally unplayable just with regular settings, but using the AI computation could get the frames into the 20s and maybe 30s, which was quite impressive to see. I saw no artifacting and irregularities with my testing of DLSS. Obviously some people say it's very sharp, and an example in Monster Hunter World, which utilizes the technology, you can move the slider around to make it sharp or finer, and it's great just to leave it at default, and I couldn't, at least for my eyes, tell really any major difference or look of post-processing. It looked really great to me. For the rest of us mere mortals who are at 4K, 1440p, and 1080p, obviously aside from having a strong CPU to not bottleneck this card, 4K is truly the sweet spot. There are so many titles I saw a 2, 3, 4, 5, almost 6x improvement in at 4K, where you can go ahead, crank everything, and things that were literally unplayable before are now buttery smooth and almost competitive frame rates. This card has no problem on nearly all titles, perhaps except Crysis 3, just obliterating 4K, and that's fantastic to see. Even Crysis 3, the frame rates were brought up from about 10 to 15 closer to 60, and that's plenty good enough for a title that still to this day has the moniker of "Can it run Crysis?" as it is state-of-the-art. So obviously, hopefully looking down the road, this will encourage more and more developers to focus on optimizing for DX12, Ampere, and of course AMD's new line of cards as well, whether you're using hardware or software-based ray tracing, to continue to encourage and push the graphical fidelity as the tech continues and goes on. Some examples like in TX7 in Doom 2020, you can already have 8K playable today, where this card can do 8K 60 across the board, no problems, almost no drops. Meanwhile, other games such as Planet Coaster, Crysis 3, and others are very engine bound or CPU bound or simply graphics bound still in their implementations and just need a mix of raw higher CPU, IPC, and capability, such as from the Ryzen series, and better CPUs than what I can test here, or simply need even more graphic power than what's presented on hand. But obviously, all companies have to lockstep in terms with the consoles and gauge what they can supply to consumers at any given point in time. So now with all the new consoles out, it's great to see a new wave of hardware and software coming up to speed for both the console and PC gaming space. So originally I was going to film this before AMD's big Navi 6000 series keynote a week or so ago, but obviously this got delayed. So it's really cool to see AMD also try to rise up to NVIDIA with their 6800, 6900 series cards for about the same value and present another great competitor to both NVIDIA and Intel in the graphics space. Obviously the cards cost a little less and they perform pretty close, so again, just like the CPUs, you can't really fault either company for trying hard, being on par with consoles or exceeding, and regardless if you're on Team Red or Team Green, it's never been a better time to be a PC enthusiast or a console gamer. And while the 3090 is expensive, it certainly still holds its crown as an incredibly powerful gaming workstation card. So guys, that wraps it up. Hope you found this video enjoyable, helpful, insightful, and got to look through all the graphs, and at least for my limited testing, gave you guys some ideas as to if you're looking at a 3090 or even a 3080 or a 3070 in the Ampere stack as to where the performance will line up. And as always, smash that like button and that bell and follow along, and I'll have more videos in the future. Thanks for watching.